back a number of years ago, I used to do a lot of travel for the denomination, for the United Methodist Church, as I was registrar for the Board of Ordained Ministry. And so I'd be on a flight here and a flight there, attending meetings and representing the East Ohio Annual Conference. And as I was returning home from one of those meetings, I believe it was Denver, that the flight was routed through Detroit. And as I'm pulling my bag along behind me and walking down that corridor to get to the next gate, all of a sudden a couple of young men in front of me fell to their feet and threw out some mats and knelt and started bowing down. And I thought for a moment, what on earth happened? They must have fainted. Maybe they were sick. They had the flu or some disease of some kind that they'd picked up who knows where. And it wasn't until I stopped for a second and began to take in what was happening that here were a couple of Muslims. That in the middle of a corridor where people were walking to and fro frantically, some of them, to get to gates so that they could connect with a flight, to meet with a loved one, or to end up in a business meeting somewhere, to get home so that they could enjoy an evening with their family and a home-cooked meal. Here were two men, young men, that were praying. They were praying. I stood there for a moment and I began to ask myself, well, what would I do? I mean, would I all of a sudden stop in the middle of that corridor and would I bow my head? Would I put my hands together, or would I lift them up and would I begin to pray out loud in the same way that they were? Or would I be too embarrassed to do so? In fact, I began to wonder, not just me, but how many of us would be willing to bow down in the middle of the street, to go to our knees, to pray. I mean, it's hard enough, I can tell you, it's hard enough for us, for me, for us to get Christians to pray even in the confines of these four walls. It's hard when we go to restaurants with those that have been disciples and Christians for decades, that all of a sudden when the food comes to a restaurant, there's not even a moment's hesitation to give thanks to God before we eat. Why am I asking this question? Why are we bringing this up? Do we want people to feel embarrassed to pray in public, or are we saying, you know what, we need to be careful of what other people think about us? Because we would never want to be embarrassed in public. Or might I say, might we be embarrassed if we needed to confess our faith in Jesus Christ? I mean, we might say we pray privately, we close our eyes and maybe keep one eye open just to make sure we don't miss anything. We sit in here and we sing our praises to God. We unashamedly share what God has done in our lives inside these four walls, but what changes when we leave? Do we stop talking about Jesus? Does our life cease, our life of faith? Or do we step down from that pedestal? Do we lock up that faith inside until we come back in the doors? So much so that we don't want it to seep through into anything that we do, anything that we say. In fact, it's called being a witness. When those two gentlemen knelt down and prayed, they were not only being true to their beliefs and their faith, but it was also a witness to all those around of their belief. So I thought, you know what, as I was working on this message, might it be necessary for me to define what it means to be a witness? The definition of a witness is a person or individual who sees something or hears something and then is compelled to tell about it. We can think of all kinds of ways in which we're witnesses. I mean, for example, if you're standing on the side of the street and you see an auto accident and you get asked, did you see what happened? And you say, yes, I was right here. I saw the whole thing. And you would tell your story of what you saw and what you heard. Sometimes people are called to be witnesses just to a signature. It's called a notary public, by the way. They have to witness that it is actually you that's signing that paper. If you want to get an auto loan or a mortgage, home mortgage. And sometimes it's even for regular court papers or regular driver's license that they have to attest that you actually are the one that's applying for that driver's license. We need witnesses everywhere we go. They're important to us. Sometimes it's a handshake that we ask someone to witness a handshake of a deal that we are about to enter into. If the Pittsburgh Steelers win and the Browns lose, let's shake on it. You will do this, or I will do that. And we say, let's get a witness to that. Somebody pay attention to what we're talking about and verify it. You see, in the New Testament, Jesus called upon Peter and his disciples to be witnesses. Why? Peter had seen, and the disciples had seen the miracles that Jesus did. I mean, the disciples had sat around and they had listened to the teaching of Jesus. They began to understand some of what Jesus was saying to those that were coming to him. And after the resurrection, Peter became a witness to the incredible glory and gift of God's grace. But we like to say that's where it stops. That was for them. But we are also called to be witnesses. In the last part of Matthew, it's told that we are to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, which are in essence symbols of moving out into the world to share the good news, to tell the story to our friends, to our families, to those that we come in contact with. But I have to ask the question, you know what it's going to be. Do we tell them the story about God's love? Oh, we're more than happy to tell the story. Do you remember the time when we were walking and there was this, and you tell the story because you were a witness to it? It was something that you wanted to share. It brings back a memory. It moves the relationship between the two individuals closer. So my question is, do we really witness? You see, we think witness is knocking on a door and saying, do you know, and cramming a cookie into somebody's mouth or turning around and dragging them to church. But a witness is simply telling someone what we have experienced, what we have seen, what we have heard. Maybe the question really is that, have we experienced God? Do we know God? Have we experienced what God is doing in our lives? So much so that we even recognize that God has been so good to us. God has blessed us with families, with friends. That God has provided us a warm place to live and food to eat, jobs that can provide for our needs and for the needs of others. What's our excuse? I mean, I don't believe it's possible to make up an excuse for not sharing what we have experienced from God. I don't think we can make up an excuse. In fact, we have no issues being a bad witness. You see, it doesn't mean that we have to preach. It doesn't mean we have to put on a show. It simply means live your life and be natural. Don't be awkward in the way that we live our lives. Simply live our lives reflecting what we have experienced. In fact, I read a book not too long ago of a man that asked the question, why people join the church. And he made a whole list of why people join the church. You know, some come because they have a family problem. Some come because they have a crisis in their lives. Some come because they get married and they feel it's the right thing to do, or there's a death, a transition in their family system, or some sort of things like that. Or a child is born and the couple decides we need to start off on the right foot. But he said the biggest reason that people actually come to church is because they have seen a friend or a relative that simply witnessed about what God was doing in their lives. Not trying to drag someone else to church, not trying to drag someone else to Jesus, but simply living our lives in such a way that people start saying, I wonder what that is. If the world needs anything, it desperately needs a good news, a good witness. Because I believe that the story of grace and the story of God's love is the greatest story that we can tell through our lives. It's a story that brings joy. It's a story that can provide us comfort when we find ourselves struggling in life. It's a story that says, don't give up. There is hope because of Jesus Christ. There is hope in the life that we live because we know that someone is there. And so the question is really this. Are we telling the story of what God has done for us? Or maybe we just don't see what God is doing in our lives. It's become so ordinary for us that we don't pay attention to the small things that God is doing every moment in our lives. A true story of, in years, decades, maybe a long time ago, of a doctor that was teaching medical students. And as he was there teaching this classroom that is filled with individuals who wanted to be doctors, he said he held up this beaker of urine. And he says, I want you to know, class, that you can tell what is ailing an individual by their urine. He says, you simply dip your finger in and then you taste it, and you can tell what's going on in an individual's body. So he says, now I want you, he passed this beaker around to the class and said, I want you to do exactly what I did. And each of those students dipped their finger in, stuck it in their mouth, and then he said to the students, he says, now, how observant are you in what I have taught you? They were sure they had done it all correctly. But you see, what they didn't observe was he used this finger into the beaker and this finger into his mouth. I simply say, my friends, how observant are we of what God is doing in our lives so that we might be witnesses of God's great love and grace. Let us pray. Most holy God, we thank you that you have given us such an incredible story to tell. Help us to be attentive to even the most minute way in which you are helping us and bringing grace into our lives. Help us to see that and want to share, not in a way that's coercive or a way that's guilting someone, but that we're sharing out of joy of what you are doing in our lives. Oh, most holy God, open our eyes. That's what we often hear. Open our eyes that we might see what you are bringing across and into our lives. For the sole purpose of sharing of your love and grace.